Hello, everyone, and welcome to part two of our lecture series on World War II. In this one, we're going to talk about really everything after the Battle of Britain. And remember from the last one, don't worry about the numbering on the title of this lecture, as this is from my world history class, regular world history class. I created this for them, but we're just talking about the war itself. So this presentation will suffice and do what we need it to do. So let's get started and talk about the remainder of the war and finish our two-part series here on World War II. All right. So just to kind of give you guys a reminder here, this is the situation in Europe um, as we start. So we last left off, we talked about um, Dunkirk and the British and French getting off of the continent there, the Germans taking over France, and then the British gaining victory into the Battle of Britain. But today we're going to see the rest of the course of the war after the fall of 1940. We're going to see some things start to change for the Allies, whether it's in North Africa or the Germans are going to ultimately invade the Soviet Union and suffer some setbacks, and then eventually it's going to lead to their downfall, and then the Allies themselves in the West invading and then coming in that way as well. So we're going to talk about that, and but ultimately this map here discusses World War II in Europe after the Battle of Britain. All right, so let's get started. So this is where we stand. Like I said, I already kind of mentioned that with you guys. Now this is the actual map in 1942, so we're actually not totally where we stand here. Again, like I said, we're taking this lecture from the standpoint from another course. So we're going to talk a little bit about events that actually will get us to this point. So as we talk about kind of the German invasion of the Soviet Union, some actions in North Africa, and the Japanese actions with Pearl Harbor, and until the Battle of Midway, that's what we need to talk about before we get to this map specifically. All right, so let's talk about some planning for the war itself, at least on the Allied side. So we're going to kind of jump back and forth here a little bit between the period of the Battle of Britain and kind of Pearl Harbor and Operation Barbarossa. But when the United States was attacked by the Japanese at Pearl Harbor, this actually was a big benefit for the Allied cause, because now it meant their biggest nation could be the biggest nation that was sympathetic to the Allies was now on their side, and they were in the same boat, you could say. Now, before the Japanese attack and before the United States came into the war, they were already lending things to the Allies and had agreements, whether it was the Atlantic Charter in 1940 between FDR and Churchill. There were still some agreements that kind of put them on a war footing, even though they weren't technically at war. Now, Churchill traveled to DC to actually meet FDR and talk over their war aims. They did agree that their first objective should be to attack Germany first and Italy as well, because they thought that they were the more direct threat. Well, I mean, you have to think about it. For Great Britain, Germany is more of a direct threat. And then for the United States, they suffered their big setback at Pearl Harbor in the Pacific, but they still have the Pacific that protects them, and they have a close relationship with the British. So let's talk about here the Battle of Atlantic a little bit. The German goal in the Battle of the Atlantic was to prevent goods from reaching Britain primarily, but also the Soviet Union. And the United States was Britain's lifeline, as well as other parts of the Americas, like Argentina and other places that gave them goods, because Britain's an island, they need resources. And the Germans are going to use their U-boat force to attack these transport ships. And there's going to be some very dark days in the early part of the war until really the mid part of the war, where the U-boats are going to gain a significant upper hand in attacking these convoys. And there's a lack of escorts, which is one of the reasons why the British enter into negotiations with the United States to get destroyers. So it's that destroyers for bases agreement before the United States was actually in the war, because they're suffering high amounts of losses. Now, the Allies eventually organized their ships into convoy systems. They developed better anti-submarine techniques, but they will gain an upper hand, whether it's through technology such as sonar, the advent of the escort carrier, new forms of aircraft, and better forms of aircraft that could, fly over the Atlantic Ocean. and not need to land on a carrier, or only once. And then also U.S. construction methods and their might in constructing Liberty ships just meant that they could actually outproduce or outpace the losses they were suffering once the United States got up and running at a full economic capacity. Now, I told you we kind of would skip over or jump back and forth between the German invasion of the Soviet Union to Pearl Harbor, so we kind of did that. But basically, guys, the reason why I did that is because, one, this is a different lecture, but also because a lot of you guys already should know that what Pearl Harbor is, and that's not to take anything away from it, but you should know it. And then also the German invasion of the Soviet Union up until the point where they suffered their first significant debilitating setback at Stalingrad is really kind of the story of the Germans defeating large amounts of Soviets. They get pushed back at Moscow, and then they restart their invasion in a campaign starting in the spring, late spring, early summer of 1942, and they get to Stalingrad, which brings us here. And the Stalingrad battle is the turning point of the war, specifically in Europe, but really it's the full turning point overall, especially when you combine it with Midway in the Pacific. But by the summer of 1942, Hitler is trying to get to the Caucasus oil fields. He wants the oil. Germany needs the oil for their war machine. They don't have enough of it. They push the Soviets to the banks of the Volga, which is where Stalingrad is located. And Stalin basically orders that every troop there, they need to fight out to the last man. I mean, it's kind of this war it's to the last man standing in this case. And it's for a city that is his. And ultimately, it'd be very interesting to see how the war would play out if Stalingrad had been taken by the Germans. But it's a brutal campaign. It's brutal house-to-house fighting. It's just a meat grinder for both forces on each side. And the Soviets will counterattack in Operation Uranus to actually that allows them to actually encircle the city and ultimately leads the German Sixth Army, which is holding the city, to surrender by the last day of January of 1943. The Soviets are going to, for their part, even though it's a victory, they're going to suffer over 1.1 million casualties just in this battle, specifically deaths. And just to think about the grand scale of how many people are killed in this battle, just on the Soviet side, they lose 1.1 million. Now we're going to jump to North Africa. Sorry. The Allies wanted a second front. Specifically, Stalin did, because he wanted to relieve pressure against him in the East. So the Allies, led by the British and the Americans, as well as the French, are going to play a little bit of a role here, are going to launch Operation Torch in November of 1942. And this is where the Allies are going to land in western North Africa. The commander of these forces is Dwight Eisenhower, the future U.S. president. And when you combine this operation with the British victory in the western part of North Africa, in Egypt, at the Battle of El Alamein, where the British Commonwealth forces defeat Rommel's Afrika Corps, you see a campaign where the Allies, which are having some trouble, now gain the upper hand in North Africa, and they force the Axis forces out of North Africa by May of 1943. And this is really important because this, when you combine the Allied victory in North Africa with the fairly recent victory of the Soviets in or at Stalingrad, you have a complete reversal in the war in Europe, or the war in the Western theater, or the war in Europe, European theater. Couldn't think of the term. Don't know why. So one other thing that you need to talk about here, or we need to talk about here, is the Casablanca Conference. And this is where Churchill and FDR agreed to only accept unconditional surrender from the Germans, which means they're going to fight them until they break them. And for all intents and purposes, it means they're going to fight them until Hitler's dead, and then somebody chooses to surrender. Here you guys can see this is Operation Torch here. The task force hitting in Morocco and Algiers. This is a picture of U.S. forces landing there. And then this is actually a picture of British forces in the Battle of El Alamein. So now we're going to move on to Italy. So Italy was the so-called soft underbelly of Europe. It really wasn't that soft. It was quite a difficult and long-standing campaign that would take the rest of the war. But the start of it is the Allies launch, at the start of it, they launch Operation Husky, which is where the Allies capture Sicily. Now, the victory here by the Allies actually leads to Italy surrendering and leaving the side of the Germans, at least a significant portion of their resources, and some Italians come over to the Allies, while some will continue to fight with the Nazis for the remainder of the war, but Mussolini is forced to resign. Now, this leads to Hitler having to take more troops away from other places in Europe, most notably against the Soviets, and sending troops into Germany. And he unleashes a bitter campaign that's going to last until the end of the war. And the Allies are going to slowly work their way up the Italian peninsula, whether it's Anzio or Monte Cassino, as you see at the bottom of the screen. But ultimately, the Allies will be victorious in at least taking Rome by June 4th of 1944. Now let's talk about some heroes. We're gonna actually move into American history a little bit, just to kind of give you guys a little bit more information. We do see, at least in U.S. forces, but also in all the other Allied forces, there's so many colonial groups that are important in colonial forces that fight and die for their parent countries. That you see diversity in this war, and just like you saw in World War I, it's not really any different. But in the sake of here, for what we see on screen, we see the Tuskegee Airmen, which are a group of black fighter pilots that are going to win great fame, and they're actually not going to lose a single bomber to an enemy fighter when they protect them, which is awesome and almost unthinkable when you think about the nature of the air campaigns over Germany. You have the 92nd Infantry Division in the U.S. forces that is a black infantry division. You see Mexican Americans across U.S. forces that fight. They do serve in segregated units. And you see the all-Japanese 100th Battalion or Nisi Regiment, and they become the most decorated U.S. Unit in history fighting in the Italian campaign. So we have mixture, even though, again, you can still see the racism and setup of the colonial and racist ties of basically these white European-based countries, whether it's here in the United States, in this example, or in how the colonial or imperial troops are treated by the British and French and others, just like we saw in World War I. So now we're going to move on to Operation Overlord. This is the Allied invasion of Western Europe, primarily done by the Americans, British, and Canadians, as well as the other Allied forces, but they were the three big ones. And they gather over 3 million men, excuse me, to invade. And they actually create a successful Phantom Army attempt to protect them from invasion, making the Germans believe that they are going to invade across at Calais, which is the shortest point between France and Great Britain, and they get them to believe this. Now, the invasion was supposed to be done a little bit earlier, but bad weather actually delayed it. But ultimately, the invasion will take place on June 6th of 1944. We're going to see airborne forces are going to be land earlier behind lines, both by the U.S. and British forces, to secure key points. The British are going to land at Gold and Sword beaches, the Canadians at Juno, and the Americans at Utah and Omaha beaches. And the Germans are going to offer actually pretty stiff resistance, specifically at Omaha Beach, but ultimately the Allies will prevail and gain a foothold on the continent. Now, this is going to be a slow and bloody campaign, at least at first, because the Allies can't really break out of this hedgerow beachhead because of the nature of these hedgerows and the geography and makeup of the Continental Peninsula where Normandy is located. But ultimately, the Allied forces led by the United States are going to launch an offensive in July. And once they break the German defenses and unleash their forces, specifically under George Patton, they are able to race across France and liberate Paris fairly quickly. The Free French forces that are with the Allies are allowed to liberate the city. And by September of 1944, the Allies are going to be on the doorstep of Germany. They're going to be in Belgium. They're going to be in Luxembourg. They're going to be in Holland as well. But they're overstretched. And they decide to launch this campaign. They only have enough resources for one. Patton's arguing, I need resources. Montgomery up north, the British general's arguing, I need resources. The Allied commanders decide to go with Montgomery's plan of Operation Market Garden, where they're going to basically have an invasion force using armor and then land airborne forces at key points ahead of time will allow them to get across the Rhine. It fails miserably, and it's going to draw the war out a little bit. Now, you basically settle down into a kind of a stalemate along this area until Christmas, the Christmas period of 1944, when Hitler launches his last ditch effort in the West with the Ardennes offensive, which leads to, or what we call, the Battle of the Bulge. And the Allies are caught off guard. You see them get pushed back nearly 60 miles and creating this bulge, which is why they call it the Battle of the Bulge. You see instances where U.S. troops are executed, for example, at Malmedy, by SS soldiers. But one thing that actually helps the Allies is the 101st Airborne. They are bussed into Bastogne and they hold on, and they hold out and draw German forces back, while the rest of the Allied perimeter is able to kind of stop the bulge and the offensive is stopped. And then from there, the Allies are able to push back, and the Germans just can't replace the losses they're losing at this point. Here you can see the bulge itself, and you can see the 101st Airborne kind of being in the middle of it and holding them back. All right, so now we're talking about liberation and surrender, and then ultimately death. So this is kind of this is the ending of the war in Europe. The Soviets are going to be the ones that are launching significant invasions and campaigns on the Eastern Front, whether they win at Kursk or in other places. But by 1944, they're entering Poland, and they're the first to liberate death camps and the see what the Germans have been doing to the Jews specifically. There's evidence coming out. But by 1945, the Allies on both sides are pushing Germany back to their borders, and the Soviet Union is poised to deal that final stroke against the Germans and take them out, especially at Berlin. Now, in April, it's a big month because FDR dies. So that means Harry Truman is going to take over as U.S. president. We see the Soviets storm Berlin and ultimately take the city. Hitler kills himself, and then the Germans, they're going to surrender on May 8th, and this is going to lead to what we call VE Day, or Victory in Europe Day. So now we're going to jump to the Pacific here. This is just like the same map we started with. This is the war in the Pacific. You can see with Pearl Harbor and so forth. But we're going to get into this and talk about kind of how the United States mainly, but also the British and Australian forces are going to defeat the Japanese. But remember, there's key points here early in the war. We have Pearl Harbor, which starts at the Battle of Midway is going to be the turning point in this theater of war, and then significant victories here down for the United States. Coral Sea before Midway, which was kind of a draw, and then you have the Guadalcanal here in the Solomon Islands. So ultimately, what happens is the attack on Pearl Harbor, although it was a success for the Japanese, it did two things. It missed two things: the U.S. submarines, and specifically, more importantly, their aircraft carriers. But by June of 1942, the Japanese are able to control Hong Kong, Indochina, Thailand, much of China, take significant portions of the Dutch East Indies. They even are able to invade the Aleutian Islands in Alaska in their campaign that's in concert with Midway. They do invade and conquer the Philippines in 1941 and early 1942. Douglas MacArthur famously says, "I shall return." And the Japanese look like an unstoppable force, just like the Germans. Now, the Americans hit back after Pearl Harbor in the Doolittle raid against Tokyo, which really doesn't do a whole lot, but it's a huge morale boost and does show the Japanese that the Americans are willing to fight and can hit the Japanese homeland. You have the Battle of the Coral Sea, which is basically a draw, but it's the first battle in history that is only fought by forces that don't see each other on sea. So it's fought by carrier-based aircraft completely, and this marks the Allies stopping the Japanese drive on Australia. So now we're going to talk about Midway. I mentioned it previously. Midway is the turning point. Midway is where the Japanese, their power is going to be severely crippled, and it's because the U.S. were able to break the Japanese intelligence codes and know when and where they were coming. And obviously, it took some luck, but they were able to sink 4 Japanese carriers and even the odds, and actually gain better odds as the war moved forward. And this is basically the beginning, even though it's going to be a slow end, of the Japanese war effort. So now the Allies, they're going to attack You have Guadalcanal. It's going to be the first Allied area for offensive across the Pacific. It's going to be an Allied victory. The Japanese abandon the island. It's the first Japanese land defeat, and this is actually going to mark the beginning of MacArthur's island hopping campaign, where they're going to hop across certain islands in the Pacific and avoid certain places to kind of starve out Japanese garrisons. Now, ultimately, MacArthur will return to the Philippines in October of 1944 and attack there. And this is where the Japanese introduced their new desperation attacks with their planes, known as kamikaze attacks on particularly U.S. ships. Now we're going to I know we're skipping over a lot, but again, you guys can study the war itself on your own. We're going to move on to two of the last significant invasions in World War II in the Pacific with Iwo Jima and Okinawa. Now, Iwo Jima was a place that the U.S. wanted to get because it was, even though it was a small island, they wanted it so they could build an airport and have it as an air base for launching bombing runs on Japan. And they were able to do that. You're going to have 6,000 Marines die, and really what the Japanese would do throughout the war is they typically wouldn't surrender. And here's a good case of it. Of the thousands that were on the island, only 200 survived because majority of them either killed themselves or fought to the death. And then at Okinawa, this one's significant because Okinawa was actually Japanese homeland territory. And the Japanese launched desperate attacks, whether it's through kamikazes or the defense of the island, to protect these home territories. And this is significant because the desperation they fight with on Okinawa, which is Japanese home territory, is a foreshadowing to what the Allies think could happen to their forces if they actually invaded the home islands of Japan. And if they think that it's going to be this bad just for this small island, they're worried about how it's going to be to just invade the main islands of Japan. Here you guys get the famous flag raising at Iwo Jima, even though this is actually comes after the actual original one with a much smaller flag. And then we're going to jump and talk about the Manhattan Project. This is a program that was led by Oppenheimer, and it was there to develop an atomic bomb. And this is the best kept secret of the war. There were tests in Alamogordo, New Mexico, and the U.S. is able to produce an atomic bomb that effectively works. But Harry Truman's faced with a tough decision. Does he use the bomb or not? Okay. He warns that Japan, it would face prompt and utter destruction. And this is something that you guys are actually going to write about. You're going to read a bunch of stuff and kind of make an argumentation, should the bomb been used or not. So the bomb, it's dropped on Hiroshima on August 6th. Enola Gay drops the little boy and levels the city. But the Japanese refuse to surrender. So 3 days later, the United States dropped Fat Man, the second bomb, on Nagasaki, and half the city's destroyed. We see over 200,000 die from injuries or radiation by the end of the year after just the direct effects of the bombings themselves. But ultimately, Emperor Hirohito does decide to surrender to the United States a few days later. And then on September 2nd, the Japanese surrender on board the U.S. battleship USS Missouri. And this is the effective end date for World War II, which is known as VJ Day, or Victory over Japan Day, and ending the war. And here you can see the dropping of the bomb, or one of the bombs. And some destruction. I believe this is in Nagasaki. And then we just have a few more slides here to finish up. We have the Yalta Conference. Now, the Yalta Conference took place, and basically this is where I have the date wrong. It should be earlier. Or no, I don't have it wrong. My bad. The big three meet at the Black Sea resort of Yalta, and they agree what is going to be the fate of they don't necessarily agree, but they discuss the fate of Germany and the post-war world. And FDR wants to concede to Stalin, but Churchill doesn't want to. But the reason why FDR wants to concede to Stalin at least a little bit is he wants the Soviets to help the United States in fighting Japan, because the atomic bomb's not ready yet, and he doesn't necessarily know if it's going to be, or even if he wants to use it. And so he needs the Soviet support. He also wants Soviet support for starting something known as the United Nations, basically an extension or improvement, on the League of Nations. But they agreed to a temporary division of Germany, and this will become more important, and we'll talk more about this temporary division in the next unit. So afterwards, we do have the Nuremberg trials after the war. This is the reparations and trials to actually make the German leadership pay for the Holocaust. We see 24 Nazi leaders are put on trial for their crimes against humanity and ultimately the Jews and other war crimes. 12 are sentenced to death. Many are face other imprisonment charges and so forth. But basically, it's there to establish responsibility for actions even in war. And you're going to see something similar to this actually occur against the Japanese leadership as well. Now, ultimately, we won't talk about the occupation in Germany until a little bit later, but we do have U.S. forces are going to occupy Japan, and they're going to work to rebuild the country. And you're going to see Japan actually grow significantly out of this occupation. They're going to become one of the largest free market economies in the world. They're going to adopt a new constitution where women gain the right to vote, and there's going to be some advancements there. And that's really all I have for you guys. I know this was kind of really fast. World War II is a hard subject to lecture on just two quick lectures covering about just over 40 minutes. So I apologize if it feels like we jumped across a lot of stuff, but it was just kind of an overview of the main highlights of the war. All right, guys, I'll see you in the next one.